Hello and welcome to Security Leaders, the podcast where we speak to security managers, chief security officers, and professionals from across the security spectrum. My name is Neil Sutton, editor of Canadian Security Magazine. My guest for this episode is Rui Rodrigues, loss prevention and risk management expert and principal consultant at Ruca Consulting. Rui has worked with retailers including HBC, ICI, Best Buy, Staples, and Holt Renfrew. As a consultant, he continues to work with retail organizations specializing in strategic and tactical program design, people development, and threat and risk assessment. Rui has also been actively involved with the Retail Council of Canada for over 20 years. In July of last year, he joined the RCC as the resident advisor for loss prevention and risk management. I recently spoke to Rui about some of the major issues facing retailers and LP professionals today, including the serious setbacks experienced during the pandemic, de-escalation techniques when faced with the threat of violence, working effectively with police responders, and his work with the Retail Council of Canada. Before my conversation with Rui, here's a quick message from our sponsor, Commissionaires.
The biggest issues in terms of dealing with loss prevention, hiring the right people, and the manager being very much engaged with what's going on. The indications that there is video monitoring matters. People are conscious of those things. Training staff to be vigilant and be switched on to the possibilities of those things happening there makes a big difference. Those people that you can count on become your best and most vigilant people to deal with shoplifters. I'm Stephen Grant, the Risk and Resilience Advisor for Commissionaires. If you wish to learn more, check commissionaires.ca.
So thank you, Rui, for joining us today. We appreciate you sharing your insights with us on today's podcast.
Pleasure, Neil. Great to be here.
So let's start with one of the bigger questions. Retailers were clearly hit pretty hard during the pandemic. It was one of the sectors that was most directly affected by what was going on, the lockdowns and so on. What do you think the lessons learned were for loss prevention professionals during this period?
Well, I think there's a few, but one of the key ones I think is, there were certain retailers that, of course, stayed open as part of the essential services, whether it's pharmaceutical, grocery, and others. So those folks saw de-escalation throughout the pandemic, the increase of violence, aggression by individuals, whether it's normal folks just getting a bit more aggressive, but also more the criminals that got more aggressive throughout. For those that were closed and then had to reopen, I think one of the biggest pieces coming out of COVID, the pandemic, is retailers seeing this surge of violence that is occurring. So increased violence, increased weapons being used in the commission of offenses. A lot of LP professionals and their leaders and organizations recognize that you have to make a significant investment in retraining your personnel. You may have been, for a year not really dealing with the public. And coming out of that, not only are you dealing with the public, but you're dealing with a much more aggressive public. So I think LP professionals for themselves had to go back to retraining on some of the de-escalation techniques, aggressive, be ready for those type of situations, but then also leverage those folks as part of your front lines to also train your employees and managers, because they themselves, of course, also are facing these escalated issues, escalated violence and aggressiveness in retail. So I think that's a big part for a lot of LP professionals is, if all you did before or part of what you did before was shoplifting deterrence, monitoring for those things, audits, I think you become a great educator coming out of this to make sure everybody at the front line dealing with customers today is getting that additional training around de-escalation, the recognition of aggressive behavior, how to recognize it, how to create that space, how to address it, because the focus has really gone from security to a security and safety. And the primary focus is keeping everybody safe, your employees, customers. And that's really, I think, added an additional lens to the LP professionals who before may not have been, the teachers of personal safety in that I think you need to. And I would say lastly, not every organization has LP on the front line in stores. Some of them are district, regional players. So their role is more to teach the frontline workers and managers. So that puts a lot more onus on them, maybe moving away from auditing for shrink and auditing for operational excellence to really focusing on what can we do to help the organization train and keep our frontline workers safe and shift their repertoire and their abilities more to that, which may have required a little bit of training for them as well, right? Because they become more of people leaders, people coaches, rather than necessarily process or security type. So I think it's allowed the LP industry to, I think, increase the things they may be able to help their organizations with, but certainly with a focus on safety and meeting this increasing tide of violence that we're seeing, aggressive behavior that we're seeing.
Yeah, it seems like for some people who were frustrated during the pandemic or didn't agree with some of the protocols that were in place, their point of contact was with that frontline person, was with somebody that worked in a retail outlet that was deemed essential and could stay open during the pandemic. So have LP professionals become more adept at sort of handling some of these rises in temper or potential aggressiveness? There was a lot of people that refused to wear, or some people who might have refused to wear masks or didn't want to follow policy, and the recourse for the frontline professional was to do what they could to try and make the best of that situation.
Yeah, 100%. And I think previous to COVID and the pandemic, LP professionals would have seen some of this, but in smaller case, right? So if you were dealing with a shoplifting incident, a violent incident, I think an LP professional's approach, not all the time, but most cases would be, I'm going to observe, do I have found committing of theft? If my organization's protocol is to make apprehensions, I engage in the safest manner, I do that, now, I think with everything happening through the pandemic, a different lens of who is the individual. Is it a person who's just gotten frustrated because they've been waiting in the line because somebody else beside them is not wearing a mask and they are, and maybe they're dealing with that? Is it somebody who's been cooped up for a year and just, maybe the mental health issues are putting people more on edge? So rather than just, monitoring for a shoplifter committing a crime and then deciding what do I do with that and following my protocol, now you're dealing with people that maybe get aggravated for a lot of different situations and the decisions aren't as clear. So you become this ambassador of safety, right? Our goal is to try to see if you can de-escalate, but with that comes the powers of observation. Is what's causing the escalation? Is it an outright person trying to steal and it's become violent because of their commission of theft, or is it somebody who's just gone vocal, maybe swearing at, doesn't like our refund policy, doesn't like what we've had to say, and is there a way for us to engage in this conversation in a way to try to salvage it to the point where we can get them to calm down, address their concern, and keep everybody else safe? And a lot of times it's going to be a manager or LP that will step into that situation that may have the higher training and ask the associate to back away and engage in it. So I think that has definitely changed because it's no longer just the person's being aggressive, so I'm going to detain them, arrest them, they're causing mischief. It's what's driving the aggression and what's the best thing to apply to it to try to dissuade, de-escalate the situation and get it to the best possible resolution, recognizing that I might be looking at an addiction issue, a mental health issue. There's all kinds of different reasons for the aggression.
You raise an interesting point about what frontline security people and loss prevention professionals could do to become an ambassador for the organizations they represent. And this isn't just in retail. I would argue it's probably across most security cultures that have a frontline presence or deal with the public. But to what extent should security professionals become that customer service representative?
A great mentor told me about 20 years ago, the best deterrence to shoplifting is customer service. That hasn't changed. I think what's changed is recognizing what to apply and what treatment to apply to the different individual. Somebody wearing a large coat in the summer months, carrying backpacks, those are not necessarily indicators of somebody's going to do something bad. So just teaching people great customer service, treat every person who walks through your front doors like a potential customer, and offering that great support, assistance is the best deterrent. So yes, there's going to be times where there's a criminal organized crime, which is also on the rise, and it's very obvious, whether it's booster groups, organized crime, gangs, and those situations occur. The 80% that are shoplifters and can be met with great customer service to not provide the opportunity for them to commit the theft always been a great focus. I think it's more important now because being able to recognize a situation early and de-escalate it prevents it from the tempers flying. And frontline workers, managers, they are facing a lot. So where we provided historically training for frontline workers that are in those heightened situations, whether it's hospitals, things of that nature, they've got that type of training. It's the recognition now that, hold on a sec, retail frontline workers are under pressure like other frontline workers are, maybe not to the same degree all the time. And therefore, we need to train them on how to recognize, assess, and de-escalate situations, because in that 80% where you can, the goal is to keep it safe. If you don't know how to recognize and meet it, and you also get aggressive with that individual, the escalation just continues, and then the violence may emerge, right? So I don't think, for the situations where the person came in to steal, may have a weapon in their bag or something of that nature, and their goal is, if I can get away with it, I'm just out of here. The last thing we want to do is meet them with aggression that prompts them to use that weapon. Now, some people will use it just because they're bad people, but others that may escalate in violence and shoving and pushing, in physical behavior that wouldn't have come out unless they're met with the aggression. We need to teach people to recognize. But I would also add to that, we get to a point of, if the person who's bringing in the aggression is putting employees and customers in harm's way, then we need to sometimes take action to prevent harm from coming to others. So those LP professionals need to be trained up. If somebody is in a retail store and is causing violence with weapons and they're not leaving, we call 911. Police resources are tight. We're having concerns with that. Obviously, we're collaborating with police, courts, government to try to address that, to make sure those 911 calls from a business, a retailer, that is for an immediate threat. The person is here now and they're threatening. We want to see an immediate response. Reality is, we know that isn't happening. Police response, even in those situations, could take 15 to 20 minutes. There's other calls. So the LP folks need to be trained that in those situations where this person is about to cause harm and they're not leaving, and we need to detain that individual to protect others, including themselves, then that training has escalated as well, right? So organizations that pre-pandemic may have been thinking we're heads off, we're not making arrests, now may be reconsidering, say, well, we may still have that as part of our method, but if there is a situation where there's a violent criminal in our store who is causing harm, we may have no choice but to detain that individual, and our LP professionals need to know how to do that safely.
So you mentioned working with first responders and police, and some of the difficulties that LP professionals might have in terms of marshaling resources to combat this ongoing problem. But what can they do to make the best use of the resources they have and work effectively with police?
Well, I think internally, one thing is, have protocols to understand that everybody right now, resources are tight. So it's easy to get frustrated at police when we don't call, and there's opportunities they need to address for sure. However, not every call is urgent, right? If somebody commits a theft, no one's harmed, they've committed the theft, they left, that's not an urgent call that requires police assistance right now. So if we recognize that as businesses, that, you may call into police to file the information on the theft, but you're not calling 911 for urgent, right? Theft is committed, they're gone. It's not a 911 call. When it is urgent, and if those become what we place as 911, I think the important fact is, when you make the call to dispatch, to the communications, you have to relay the information. So it can't be, I, retailer X, I'm calling because we just had a theft, or we have a theft. It has to be, I'm calling because we have an urgent matter. There's a person in our store, they have a weapon, they're threatening our customer's employee, and it's happening now. So we need to convey the message to ensure that it's understood. This is an immediate need. There is an impending harm to people, and we need police to respond immediately. That way, the radio room, the communications prioritize those calls appropriately. It's not unheard of that if you get a call from a retailer, the perception is it's a property crime, it's not urgent. Police intake look at prioritizing calls. So, they are obviously going to flag calls for priority. Domestic abuse, other calls of a nature that are more priority are going to get priority. So if we communicate the information as it's happening and stress when there is a victim, obviously that should get a higher priority on a call. But as I said, the other part is not to call 911 for every retail incident or theft. if it's already taken place. That's you call the normal police line, and report the crime or report it online. What I would say, a lot of the colleagues I speak to in retail, they are adopting that. And it's really about training their frontline, their stores, adopting a methodology of it. It's happened. We call the non-emergency line. You only call 911 where there's an urgent need, there's an immediate need, there's threats of violence, or the perpetrator is still in our store, and you have to stress that information. So I've seen over the last 4 or 5 months, more of a move to making sure that level of communication is out there so the frontliners understand how to place those calls. The goal being that hopefully we're putting less pressure on police, right? Instead of 100 calls, they may get 20, and the other 80 go through the non-emergency. The hope then is that if you get less calls coming in from business, you should have more resources to be able to respond to those urgent calls.
Do you think retailers are working effectively with each other? Like they might be competitors in terms of the retail environment, but they're colleagues in terms of security. Are you seeing those retailers work together to share information for their mutual benefit?
Yeah, and I got to say, in 30 years of my career, probably better than I've ever seen. I have the pleasure of working with Retail Council of Canada. We formed the Loss Prevention Advisory Committee made up of 26 retailers across Canada, who really steer and guide the agenda of the priorities of LP risk management for Canada. Out of that, they also created a task force focused on working on 3 objectives that they agreed upon. The first one was addressing the increase of violence, arson, and property damage that we're seeing and continue to see. The second was to create opportunities to collaborate with police, courts, and government on these issues and work together on solutions. And the third critical one was dealing with organized retail crime and really working together to look at solutions to make an impact in reducing the organized retail crime. I've seen for the last year and a bit the level of commitment from retailers to come to the table and continue to speak. The advocacy the RCC is doing on their behalf with government. We see ministers of justice, solicitor generals, attorney generals coming to the table to speak to us across the country in various provinces and wanting to work with us on those solutions. So I think the level of collaboration just between retailers, but also the police, government, recognizing that the violence is there. It's not just a property crime. It is impacting people in the community. And there is a will to work together for solutions. In my 30 years, I haven't seen the momentum we're seeing now. I'd say it's still early stages, but the fact that the conversations are happening and the goal is around solutions, and there's provincial efforts because we recognize that in every province, the situation and the issues may be different, I think is great. So I'm optimistic, even though today we feel like we're losing the battle against crime. I'm optimistic that people are committed to looking for solutions. Retailers, there's always going to be the competitive advantage around sales and that, but in LP, we got professionals that know what to say and how to say it without revealing any proprietary information for the organizations. But it's very clear that there's a common goal to keep their employees and their customers safe in their communities, and they're going to work together to bring about solutions to do that. And I would just reiterate, I haven't seen that in 30 years, the same level of commitment that I'm seeing now, which I think is what's driving the support from police and government, because they're being met by a coalition of retailers coming together, one voice talking to them, which I think sends the message, this is serious, and therefore the response has been fairly good from those areas as well.
Great. Thank you, Rui. We appreciate you sharing your expertise with us today.
Great to do it, Neil, and I hope in the next 6 months to a year we can have a similar conversation to actually talk about some of the great outcome and solutions that have come out of the efforts.
For sure. I look forward to that. Thank you to my guest, Rui Rodrigues, and our podcast sponsor, Commissionaires. You can find more security-themed podcasts at CanadianSecurityMag.com. I'm Neil Sutton. Thanks for listening.